Somewhere between Minsk and Smolensk, we ran into resistance, and our infantry regiment commander called for a conference of his battalion, company, and battery commanders in a wooded area to plan what to do. It was not a wise thing to do because we had all the regiment's key officers together in one small area. He should not have done that, especially in the woods. But the resistance was unexpected, and it had been a long time since we had received artillery fire. As about 15 of us were planning our response to the resistance, a chilling howl sent us all diving to the ground, pressing our faces into the earth. Then came the frightful blast of the explosions. A salvo of artillery shells exploded about 10 meters above us on making contact with the trees, and shrapnel slammed into us like machine gun fire from heaven. I was unharmed, but I had seen the man lying next to me jerk with one of the explosions, and I knew he had been hit. "Medic!" I yelled. I reached for him, but it was immediately evident that he had to be dead. He had serious wounds in both his head and his back. Beads of sweat popped out of my skin, and a sudden chill made me shiver. We spread out quickly because we did not know whether they had an observer in the trees and really knew what they were doing, or whether it had just been a lucky hit. We had 2 dead and 5 or 6 wounded. Medics quickly came and took the dead and wounded away. Since we received no additional fire, we assumed that it was again just a lucky hit for them, as it had been at the bridge. The Oberlieutenant killed beside me was a reserve officer. One moment we were discussing our plans, and the next moment we lay side by side in the dirt, one dead and one unharmed. That I happened to land where I did, and he landed where he did, was just a throw of the dice. He remained where he dropped, and I walked away. How much longer would fate keep me alive? I knew the next time I might very well be the unlucky one who would drop in the wrong spot. I had to become fatalistic about it and assume that eventually it would happen to me, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. I did not wait for it to happen or stand up and present a big target. I tried to be as small a target as possible, but I knew that I was going to be killed or badly wounded sooner or later. The odds against my escaping unscathed were impossibly high, and I accepted my eventual death or maiming as part of my fate. Once I had forced myself to accept that, I could put it out of my mind and go on about my duties. I would not have been able to function had I not done so. At Orsha, between Minsk and Smolensk, the Russians had a prepared defense line that we had to overcome before we could proceed to Smolensk. A prepared defense line always consisted of several consecutive lines of trenches or foxholes, and when we attacked, we had to overrun them all. The standard procedure in all combat until now was that when attacking infantry passed over the first line of trenches or foxholes, the enemy soldiers who had been overrun and were still alive and not badly wounded would stand and raise their hands in surrender to the soldiers advancing behind the first line of attacking troops. The captured enemy soldiers, including the wounded, would then be collected and taken to the rear. While advancing in a large wooded area near Orsha, we were spread out in a line. I was with the Point Company in the center of the line. The Russian soldiers in the first line of defense were dug in so that only their heads were out of the foxholes, and they had branches over their heads, so they were very difficult to see. We received rifle fire from them, and we returned their fire and kept advancing. Then the fire became heavy. All around us were the crack of rifles, the boom of mortars, and the hollow chatter of machine guns. We overran their first line, and were attacking their second prepared line when we were suddenly aware that we were taking rifle fire from behind as well as from in front of us. Advancing German soldiers were being shot dead from behind. The Russian soldiers in the first line of trenches who should have surrendered had turned and were shooting us in the back, and some of our people were killed and wounded by this fire. Of course, their country was being invaded by the German army, and they were desperate. Still, this was at a personal level, and no German or Russian soldier could have that code of honor broken by the enemy without going almost mad, because it was the combat infantry soldiers' only hope of survival in a hopeless situation. If that hope was taken away, death was certain, and nobody wanted to die. In a combat situation, the soldier is under inhuman stress to begin with, and when he sees a friend he has been sharing his life with suddenly drop because he was shot in the back, it is too much. Our soldiers went berserk, and from that point on during the attack they took no prisoners and left no one alive in a trench or foxhole. I did not try to stop them, nor did any other officer, because they would have killed us too if we had. They were out of their minds with fury. If the Russian soldiers had put down their weapons and stood up with their hands raised, they would have been collected and marched to the rear as had always occurred in the past. Their cause was lost. They could only be taken prisoner or die. As it was, they were all killed, without mercy or remorse. That evening was a turbulent one for me, because I had never before experienced such brutality in combat. It was a quiet evening after such savageness, with blue-gray smoke rising from our field kitchen as burning logs crackled under the coffee and tea. Dusk dimmed the birch and fir trees around us. Some of the infantrymen sat about smoking and drinking coffee or tea from the field kitchen. Some ate their rations, some repaired their boots, some wrote to their wives or girlfriends or parents at a time when it would seem impossible for them to think or to feel anything but horror and exhaustion. They had clearly adapted to this new type of combat better than I had. Perhaps they felt avenged. We had buried our dead beside the trenches and foxholes where their surviving comrades were now writing letters, shaving, eating, and washing in improvised baths. These young soldiers were just glad to be alive one more day. In fact, they felt almost astonished each evening to have survived another day. I was learning to know them, and I knew that when a friend was killed, it was as though some particle of life inside them had died. And yet amid the deafening roar and horrors of battle the next day, their dead comrade's voice still sometimes would make itself heard at strange moments. I went to Kreuger's command tent to prepare for the next day's attack, as I did every evening when we expected to attack the next morning. "Hello, Knappe," he said when I entered. He drew back from the map he had been studying and motioned toward a folding chair. He looked at me for a long moment. "You did not like what you saw today," he said finally. It was not a question. No, I admitted. But I understood it. He looked at me for a long moment again, as if to see if my actions and facial expressions matched my words. "Good," he said finally. "That is important. There is nothing you or I or anyone else can do about an incident like that. The Russians took control of the situation out of our hands. The weather was dry and very hot. The days were long and the nights were short during the summer. June, July, and August gave us good weather in spite of the extreme heat, and we marched endlessly across this land of boundless expanses, this land with which none of our memories were linked. Every day of marching was just like every other day. It turned very hot in late summer, and the heat and insects did not go away at night. The lice were a torment that was to stay with us for months. We scratched with increasing zeal. We scratched arms, legs, stomach, the small of the back, and it was a constant burning in the armpits. It was worst at night, and the men would thrash restlessly in their blankets. Nothing could have prepared us for the mental depression brought on by this realization of the utter physical vastness of Russia. Tiny little doubts began to creep into our minds. Was it even possible that such vast emptiness could be conquered by foot soldiers? Occasionally, some of the peasants would still be in the villages when we arrived, not having had time to flee. They would be women, children, and old men because everyone else had been drafted. Only when we went forward very fast would we find these people. They would be either those who could not get away or those who did not want to get away. They were never mistreated in any way by the combat troops, and they showed no outward hostility toward us. They seemed to be neutral, and some actually greeted us. Of course, any Russian civilians who were communists probably had left with the Russian army if they could, and those remaining were people who had been oppressed by the Communist Party. The only hostility I ever witnessed from Russian citizens came when some of our soldiers laughed as they watched two children scratching themselves because of lice. Their mother became angry. "These are German lice. You brought them here," she said sternly. We had picked up enough of the Russian language to understand her. It was not true, because we had got the lice from sleeping in Russian huts, but I apologized for the men as best I could with the language barrier and tried to appease her. Sometimes during the fighting, the Russians would shell their own villages if we were in them. When that happened, the Russian civilians were in the same boat we were in, and in situations like that, nationality is not a factor, survival is all that matters. We would all just try to protect ourselves, and we also protected the others if we could. They cooperated with us in extinguishing lights at night and keeping their windows covered. I have a vivid recollection of lying on the ground near a peasant hut as Russian artillery shells exploded nearby. I slowly became aware of an elderly Russian peasant woman lying near me. When she saw me look at her, she smiled reassuringly. She reminded me of nothing so much as a mother reassuring her child. Smolensk had been pretty much destroyed by the time we got to it. The railroad station had been obliterated because it had been defended so fiercely. Hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners had been taken there. Although we did not stay in the city, we were in the Smolensk area for about a week, resting, repairing equipment, replenishing worn-out equipment, shoeing horses, and recuperating in general. I wrote to Lilo every day while we rested at Smolensk to try to make up for the days I had not written during the march. I did not tell her about the killing and dying, or about the heat and the dust. I just told her of the beauty of the country around us and of the more interesting people I had met. Lilo represented beauty, civilization, and the finer things of life to me. I did not want her to know about the dehumanizing things I had seen during this endless trek across a nation where people were forced to live almost as animals. Writing these letters also helped me keep a balanced perspective. There is beauty to be found in even the most gruesome of circumstances. We launched a new offensive in early September. From Smolensk on, the Russian resistance grew stronger as we got closer to Moscow. Somewhere after Smolensk, our tanks and infantry had surrounded a huge number of Russian soldiers. Although at the time we did not realize it, the infantry we were supporting encountered resistance. So my battery went into position to support them. We march, our forward scouts draw fire, and our point battalion deploys and tries to find out how strong the resistance is. I was with the infantry, so I called back to my battery officer, Lieutenant Steinbach, to get the guns into position to fire the next morning. About an hour after midnight, all but the sentries were wrapped in their blankets and sound asleep. Major Kreuger and I were still working on our plans for the assault at dawn when we were startled to hear rifle fire behind us in the direction of my guns. We looked at each other with immediate concern. That could only mean that a battle was taking place in back of us instead of in front of us, where we thought the enemy to be, back at the approximate position of my battery. The surrounded Russians, of whom we had not been aware, apparently had decided to try to break out under cover of darkness. They were attacking my battery, which apparently lay directly in their path. And my men were defending themselves and our guns and horses, although they had only rifles with which to do so. They could not see the Russians they were shooting at, but they could hear them and they could smell them. The Russian soldiers smelled of Makhorka tobacco, which had a very strong, unpleasant odor. It was made of the stems of the tobacco leaves instead of the leaves. Only Russian officers were issued tobacco made of the leaves. This awful smell got into their thick uniforms and could be smelled for quite a distance. I relayed the report I had received to Kreuger, who passed it on to regiment headquarters, and it went from there to division. Kreuger ordered his reserve infantry company into the attack. This stopped the Russians, but the battle continued until morning with heavy losses on both sides. My battery lost a few men, the infantry company lost over 100, and the Russians lost many more. They were very disorganized and confused, and they surrendered when daylight came because they did not have heavy weapons and did not stand a chance in the daylight. We counted our losses, buried our dead, and took prisoners. Hundreds of dead Russians lay everywhere. There must have been more than a battalion of them. It may have been a corps staff or something like that. We organized a defense line against the same thing happening again the next night, and then we stayed there a day or two, licking our wounds. By then, the resistance we had encountered in front of us the day before had been fought down to small mopping-up actions.